The day began like any other, with the sun casting a warm glow through the curtains of our bedroom. I awoke early, as was my routine, and quietly slipped out of bed so as not to disturb my wife, Olivia. She lay there, her face serene in sleep, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of deep breaths. For a moment, I watched her, marveling at the calmness that seemed to envelop her in those early hours. Our marriage had its ups and downs, moments of joy interspersed with arguments and long stretches of silence, but I never imagined that this particular day would be the turning point of my life. I tiptoed down the hallway, careful not to let the floorboards creak under my weight. The house was still, the kind of stillness that only the early morning can bring. I made my way to the kitchen, the heart of our home, where the first order of business was to brew a pot of coffee. The familiar hiss and gurgle of the machine was a comforting sound, one that signaled the beginning of another day. As the rich aroma of freshly ground beans filled the room, I began preparing breakfast, a routine I had come to enjoy over the years. There was something soothing about those quiet moments in the morning, a sense of normalcy and control before the chaos of the day set in. Little did I know that the real chaos was yet to come. As I set the table, placing 2 mugs of steaming coffee in a simple spread of toast, eggs, and fruit, I heard the soft shuffle of Olivia's footsteps approaching. She entered the kitchen with a lethargy that was unusual for her, her eyes heavy with sleep, or perhaps something else. She offered me a weak smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes, and slid into her usual seat at the table. Her presence, normally warm and inviting, felt distant today. There was an almost tangible barrier between us, one that I couldn't quite place. "Good morning, honey," I said, trying to infuse my voice with the usual cheer. "Good morning," she replied, her tone flat, as if the word was an obligation rather than a greeting. She picked up her fork and began to absent-mindedly push her food around on the plate, her eyes glued to the screen of her phone. The soft glow of the device reflected in her eyes, but they seemed dull, lacking the spark I had fallen in love with. We had been together for nearly 2 decades, a relationship built on the foundation of shared experiences, love, and mutual respect. But as with any long-term marriage, the early years of passion had gradually given way to routine, and sometimes that routine became a comfortable silence. I was no stranger to these quiet moments, but there was something different in the air today, an unease that settled deep in my gut. An ominous sensation that something was off. Olivia barely touched her food, picking at it with the kind of disinterest that made my stomach churn. I watched her, trying to gauge her mood, but her expression was unreadable, a mask of indifference. She scrolled through her phone, her thumb moving rhythmically across the screen, completely absorbed in whatever it was she was looking at. I tried to engage her in conversation, to break through the wall of silence that had erected itself between us. "Olivia," I ventured, trying to sound casual, "is everything okay?" She looked up at me then, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I saw something in her eyes that I couldn't quite place, something dark, something that made my heart skip a beat. "Everything's fine," she replied, but her tone was anything but reassuring. There was a finality in her voice, a subtle edge that told me not to press further. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that it was just one of those days. We all have them, right? Days when the weight of life presses down a little harder, when words feel too heavy to speak. I finished my breakfast in silence, trying to ignore the unease that was now gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. As I left for work, I glanced back at her one last time. She was still sitting at the table, her head bowed over her phone, completely engrossed in whatever held her attention. The nagging feeling of dread lingered like a dark cloud hovering over what should have been an ordinary day, but deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be ordinary again. The day dragged on at the office, each hour creeping by as I struggled to focus on the usual parade of meetings, emails, and mind-numbing tasks. My colleagues' voices became a distant hum, and even the constant ping of incoming messages failed to jolt me out of my growing unease. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. It was a sensation I couldn't quite shake, a low buzz of anxiety that made my skin prickle. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that I was being paranoid, but the feeling only intensified as the day wore on. By the time I finally clocked out and headed home, exhaustion had settled into my bones. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white as I navigated the familiar streets of our neighborhood. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked as it always did, quaint, peaceful, a picture of suburban normalcy. But the moment I stepped through the front door, I knew that something was off. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you, making it hard to breathe. There was no sign of Olivia. Olivia? I called out, my voice echoing through the empty rooms. The sound seemed to bounce off the walls, amplifying the void. No response. I wandered through the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The kitchen was empty, the living room dark. It wasn't like Olivia to disappear like this, not without a word. My heart began to race as I moved from room to room, calling her name with increasing urgency. Finally, I found her in the living room, standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. Her back was to me, but even from behind, I could see the tension in her posture. Her shoulders were rigid, and her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. The sight of her like this sent a shiver down my spine. Something was very, very wrong. Olivia, what's going on? I asked, my voice laced with concern as I stepped closer. She didn't turn to face me right away. For a long moment, she just stood there, her gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then, finally, she turned, and the look in her eyes made my blood run cold. It wasn't the Olivia I knew, the warm, loving woman I had spent years with. This was someone else, someone distant, almost unrecognizable. We need to talk, she said, her voice cold and detached, as if she were discussing the weather rather than the fate of our marriage. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. I moved closer, my stomach churning with dread. What is it? What's wrong? She took a deep breath, her expression hardening as if she were steeling herself for what she was about to say. When she spoke, her voice was flat, devoid of any emotion, as if she had rehearsed these words 1,000 times in her head. I've been seeing someone else. The words hit me like a sledgehammer, knocking the breath out of me. I stumbled back, the room spinning around me as I tried to process what she had just said. What? How long? A few months, she admitted, her tone emotionless, as though she were discussing a business transaction. His name is Jacob. He is coming tonight, and I'm going to spend a wild night with him in our bedroom. Go make us dinner quickly, and you want to treat him like a king. Understand? I felt like I was going to be sick. My world was crashing down around me, everything I thought I knew disintegrating in an instant. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, and all I could do was stand there, numb with shock. You're serious? Yes, she replied, her eyes boring into mine with a chilling indifference. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman standing in front of me wasn't the Olivia I had married. This was someone else, someone cruel and unfeeling. Anger surged through me, hot and wild, drowning out the despair that had been threatening to swallow me whole. If he comes within a meter of this house, I'll break his jaw, and you'll be paying for it forever, I spat, my voice trembling with rage. But before I could say anything more, the front door creaked open, and the living room was suddenly filled with a shadowy figure. I turned to see a man standing in the doorway, Jacob. He was big, much bigger than I had imagined, his broad shoulders filling the frame. In his hand, he held a magnum, the cold metal gleaming menacingly in the dim light. The sight of the gun made my blood freeze in my veins. This wasn't just an affair, this was a takeover, and I was about to lose everything. My world seemed to crumble as I stood there, staring at the man who had invaded my home, my life. Jacob was massive, a hulking figure with a muscular build that made me feel small and insignificant in his presence. His presence dominated the room, casting a long shadow that seemed to swallow the light. The gun in his hand was pointed casually at the floor, as if it were just an accessory, but the threat it carried was unmistakable. It gleamed ominously in the dim light, a silent reminder of the danger that now permeated my once safe haven. I could barely process what was happening. This was my home, my sanctuary, and yet I was powerless to stop this intruder from taking over everything I held dear. My eyes flickered to Olivia, hoping to find some trace of the woman I loved, but what I saw sent a chill through my heart. She moved toward him, her demeanor shifting into something I had never seen before, something submissive, almost adoring. It was as if she had become a different person, someone who reveled in this twisted dynamic. She reached up and kissed him, her lips meeting his with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. The betrayal was so deep it felt like a physical wound. "Did you tell him, babe?" Jacob's voice was deep, almost a growl, as he wrapped a possessive arm around Olivia's waist, pulling her closer to him. She nodded, a cruel smile playing on her lips as she looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. "I did. He's going to make us dinner and serve us like a little host," her words sliced through me like a knife. This wasn't just infidelity, this was a complete and utter betrayal of everything we had built together. I wanted to fight back, to throw them both out of my house, to reclaim the life that was slipping through my fingers. But the sight of that gun kept me rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear so intense it drowned out every other emotion. The anger boiled inside me, but it was mixed with a deep sense of betrayal and fear that left me feeling hollow, like a loser. "All right, go on then," Jacob said, gesturing toward the kitchen with the barrel of the gun, his tone casual, almost bored. "Get to work." My hands trembled as I walked past them, each step feeling like I was sinking deeper into quicksand. I could hear their laughter behind me, the sound of it twisting the knife deeper into my chest with every passing second. It was a cruel, mocking sound that echoed in my mind, a reminder of just how powerless I had become. As I entered the kitchen, the familiar space felt foreign, like a prison cell I couldn't escape from. The countertops, the appliances, the table where we had shared countless meals, it all seemed tainted now, poisoned by the nightmare I was living. I began preparing the meal, my hands moving mechanically as my mind raced, trying to figure out how I had ended up in this hell. Every slice of the knife, every clang of the pan was a reminder of my powerlessness. My own home had become a prison, and I was nothing more than a slave to the twisted desires of the woman I once loved. The smell of food cooking felt nauseating, knowing that I was preparing a meal for the man who had stolen everything from me. As I worked, I could hear them talking, laughing in the other room. Their voices were low and intimate, the murmur of their conversation punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter, a sound that sent waves of nausea through me. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, each motion of my hands becoming a small act of survival. I had to get through this night, to endure somehow, even as my world crumbled around me. When dinner was finally ready, I carried the plates to the dining room, my heart pounding in my chest with every step. The weight of the plate seemed to match the burden I carried on my shoulders, a crushing load of despair and humiliation. Olivia and Jacob were sitting at the table, their hands intertwined as they waited for me. They looked at me with a mixture of amusement and disdain, their eyes reflecting the sick pleasure they took in my torment. "Well, aren't you the perfect little servant?" Olivia sneered as I set the plates down in front of them, her voice dripping with contempt. Jacob chuckled, taking a sip of the wine I had poured for them with a smug expression that made my skin crawl. "You better get used to it, pal. Things are going to change around here." The casual cruelty in his voice stoked the fire of anger that burned within me, but I knew that any resistance would be futile. The gun, the situation, the sheer audacity of it all left me with no choice but to comply. So I bit my tongue, swallowing my pride and anger, and stood there as they ate the meal I had prepared. The sound of their chewing, their casual conversation was a constant reminder of my own helplessness. It was the longest, most humiliating night of my life, a slow, torturous descent into a reality I couldn't escape. As the hours dragged on, I felt my spirit breaking, each moment chipping away at the person I used to be. I was trapped, powerless, and at their mercy, reduced to a shadow of the man I once was. The weight of the night pressed down on me, suffocating any hope I had left. As they finished their meal and continued their twisted game, I stood there, a silent witness to my own downfall, knowing that this was only the beginning of the nightmare. The days that followed Jacob's arrival were a descent into a personal hell I could have never imagined. Jacob didn't just move in, he took over, claiming dominion over every aspect of my life. My home, once a sanctuary, became a battlefield where I was constantly outmatched. He settled into my space like a king in his castle, and Olivia was his queen, a queen who seemed to take perverse pleasure in my torment. Olivia, the woman I had adored, had transformed into someone I barely recognized. Her cruelty was relentless, a daily reminder of my impotence. She treated me like a servant, issuing orders with a disdainful flick of her hand, her eyes cold and unfeeling. I was no longer her husband, I was a ghost, a mere afterthought in the house I had once ruled. Each day was a repeat of the last. I would rise early, prepare their meals, clean the house, and cater to their every whim. They flaunted their relationship openly, sharing whispered conversations, stolen glances, and intimate touches in my presence. Each display was a dagger to my heart, but I had no choice but to endure the humiliation. It was suffocating, a weight that bore down on me with every passing moment. But as the days stretched into weeks, something began to change inside me. Beneath the surface of my despair, a seed of hatred took root, slowly growing into something dark and twisted. I realized that I couldn't let them get away with this. I couldn't let them destroy me, reduce me to a shell of the man I once was. The thought of revenge became my lifeline, the one thing that kept me going. Late at night, while they slept soundly in the master bedroom that had once been mine, I lay awake in the guest room, my mind racing with thoughts of vengeance. I knew I had to be careful, to plan every detail meticulously. One wrong move and Jacob would kill me without a second thought. His brute strength and the gun he always kept close ensured that. But if I played my cards right, I could turn the tables and make them pay for what they had done. The opportunity one had been waiting for came one evening as we sat in the living room, the air thick with tension. Jacob, sipping on a glass of whiskey, mentioned that he had a business trip coming up. He would be gone for a few days, leaving me alone with Olivia. The thought of being alone with her, of having her at my mercy, filled me with a dark satisfaction. I saw the opening I had been praying for. As the days leading up to Jacob's departure passed, I meticulously prepared for what was to come. My days were spent researching poisons, poring over articles and forums that detailed their effects and how to administer them without detection. It was a risky path, fraught with danger, but I was willing to do whatever it took to end this nightmare. I couldn't afford any mistakes, everything had to be perfect. Finally, the night arrived. Jacob left for his trip, and the house fell into an uneasy silence. It was just me and Olivia, our interactions laced with the tension of unspoken animosity. She had been drinking more than usual, her inhibitions lowered as she swayed slightly on her feet, leaning against the kitchen counter with a wine glass in hand. "Why don't you make us something special tonight?" she suggested, her words slurred, a lazy smile playing on her lips. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile that I hoped looked genuine. Inside, my heart was pounding, my pulse a drumbeat in my ears, but I kept my composure. I couldn't afford to let my nerves show. I moved through the kitchen with a calm efficiency, pulling ingredients from the fridge, my hands steady as I prepared the meal. But tonight, there was a special ingredient that would make this dish unlike any other I had ever prepared. Hidden in the folds of my apron was a vial of poison I had procured, a lethal substance that would ensure Olivia wouldn't live to see another day. I added it to the sauce, mixing it in with careful precision, the aroma of the food masking the scent of death. When the meal was ready, I plated the food and carried it to the dining room. Olivia was already seated at the table, her eyes glazed from the alcohol, her lips curled into a self-satisfied smirk as she watched me approach. She didn't notice the slight tremor in my hand as I set the plate before her, nor did she see the flicker of resolve in my eyes. She was too busy gloating, too wrapped up in her own world to sense the danger lurking in her dish. I took my seat across from her, watching with a mixture of anticipation and dread as she picked up her fork and took the first bite. The seconds ticked by, each one an eternity as I waited for the poison to take effect. My heart pounded in my chest, my breathing shallow as I watched her closely, searching for any sign that it was working. At first, nothing happened. She chewed and swallowed, taking another bite, her expression unchanged. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Had I done something wrong? Was the dose too small? But then, slowly, her smug smile began to fade. Confusion flickered in her eyes, followed by a flash of fear as she clutched her throat, gasping for breath. The poison was working. I sat there, frozen, watching as Olivia's face twisted in terror. She tried to speak, to call out for help, but the words choked in her throat. Her body convulsed as the poison took hold. There was no mercy left in me, no compassion for the woman who had betrayed me so completely. I had become a monster, but I didn't care. All I cared about was the satisfaction of seeing her suffer, the cold justice of knowing that she would never hurt me again. Olivia's eyes bulged, her pupils dilated with terror as she gasped for air, her hands frantically clawing at her throat, her nails raking across her skin as if she could somehow tear the poison out of her body. The transformation from the once commanding, cruel woman who had tormented me into this helpless, terrified creature was swift and brutal. In those final moments, I saw something in her I hadn't seen in years, pure, unadulterated fear. The sight should have disturbed me, should have awakened some buried remnant of compassion, but I felt nothing. I stood there, cold and unfeeling, watching as the poison coursed through her veins. This was the justice I had longed for, the retribution I had meticulously planned. It was as if all the emotions I had been drowning in, anger, betrayal, humiliation, had been drained from me, leaving only a hollow satisfaction in their place. I was no longer the man who had cowered in the face of their cruelty. I was something else, something darker. Olivia's legs buckled, and she collapsed onto the cold kitchen tiles, her body writhing as the poison completed its grim work. Her convulsions were violent, her limbs thrashing in a desperate, instinctual fight for life, but it was a battle she had already lost. Her mouth opened and closed, gasping for breath that would never come. Her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to plead for mercy, but I had none to give. As I stood over her, I watched the life drain from her eyes. Those once bright eyes that had held love and warmth for me so long ago now fading into a dull, lifeless stare. It was surreal, almost as if I were an observer in someone else's life, watching a scene play out from a distance. The woman lying before me was no longer Olivia, she was just a shell, a hollow reminder of what she had once been and the wreckage of the life we had built together. Minutes passed, and finally, her body stilled. The convulsions stopped, her chest no longer rose and fell, and the silence that settled over the room was almost deafening. It was the silence of finality, of an ending that I had orchestrated with cold precision. Olivia was gone, her presence in this world snuffed out by my hand. I remained where I was, standing over her lifeless form, my mind oddly clear. The reality of what I had done slowly began to sink in, but instead of the crushing guilt or fear I had anticipated, I felt an eerie calm. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, but I didn't care. The woman who had betrayed me, who had taken everything from me, was dead, and soon Jacob would join her. Without a word, I turned away from Olivia's body and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her there on the cold, unforgiving tiles. There was nothing more to be done for her, no final words, no last rites. She had made her choices, and now she had paid the ultimate price. In the living room, I poured myself a drink. The glass trembled slightly in my hand, the whiskey burning as it went down, the warmth of the alcohol spreading through my chest and steadying my nerves. I needed to think clearly, to prepare for the next phase of my plan. Jacob would return soon, and when he did, I would be ready. I sank into the armchair, the familiar leather creaking under my weight as I stared into the amber liquid in my glass. The house was quiet, eerily so, the kind of quiet that only comes after something irrevocable has happened. It was a silence that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a silence that allowed me to finally take stock of everything that had led me to this point. My thoughts drifted back to the man I had been before all of this began, the man who had loved Olivia, who had believed in their future together, who had never imagined that his life could unravel in such a devastating way. That man was gone now, replaced by someone colder, harder, someone who had done what needed to be done. I knew that what I had done would have consequences, there was no escaping that. But in this moment, with Olivia's body cooling in the next room and the taste of victory lingering on my tongue, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The first part of my plan was complete. Olivia was dead, and soon Jacob would follow. I took another sip of whiskey, the alcohol numbing the edges of my thoughts. There was still work to be done, still a final act to play out before this nightmare could truly end. But for now, I allowed myself a moment of peace, a moment to breathe, to savor the victory I had so carefully crafted. The quiet stretched on, the ticking of the clock the only sound in the room. It was a sound that marked the passage of time, the countdown to Jacob's return, and when he did come back, I would be waiting. The final breath had been taken, but the final act was yet to come. The days following Olivia's death were a tense and calculated exercise in deception. I knew I had to act quickly but with a level of precision that left no room for error. The first task was to dispose of her body, a grim necessity that required every ounce of cunning I possessed. I wrapped her in heavy plastic, the kind contractors used to cover furniture, and dragged her lifeless form to the garage. The night was eerily quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I knew of a secluded spot miles away, a place where the earth was soft and the forest thick enough to mask any signs of disturbance. I drove there under the cover of darkness, the weight of what I was doing pressing down on me like a physical force. Digging the grave was laborious, each shovelful of dirt a reminder of the finality of my actions. By the time I was done, the first light of dawn was beginning to seep through the trees. I covered the grave carefully, concealing any evidence of the disturbance, and drove back home, my mind numb from the enormity of what I had just done. Back at the house, I meticulously cleaned every trace of Olivia's presence. Her clothes, her personal items, all of it was packed away as if she had simply decided to leave one day and never come back. I wiped down every surface, scrubbed every corner, making sure there was no trace of her or the crime that had taken place. It was as though she had been erased from existence, a ghost that had never been. When Jacob returned, he seemed oblivious to the tension that hung in the air like a dark cloud. He walked into the house with his usual overbearing swagger, his presence filling the space as though he owned it. I greeted him with the same forced politeness that had become second nature to me over the past few weeks. The mask of subservience was firmly in place. "Where's Olivia?" he asked casually, tossing his bags onto the floor with a thud. "She said she needed some time away," I lied smoothly, my voice betraying no hint of the truth. "Something about visiting a friend out of state." Jacob's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. His gaze lingered on me for a moment, searching for something, but then he shrugged it off. "She'll be back," he muttered more to himself than to me as he walked into the living room. "Yes," I replied, the word heavy with hidden meaning. "But you won't," I thought to myself, a cold resolve settling into my bones. For the next few days, I played the role of the obedient servant to perfection. I kept my head down, catering to Jacob's every demand, all while waiting for the right moment to strike. I knew he would be on high alert after Olivia's sudden disappearance, so I had to be patient. I had to make him feel secure, to lull him into a false sense of control. Every order he barked, every cruel comment he made was a test of my endurance. The rage inside me simmered, threatening to boil over, but I kept it tightly in check. I reminded myself of the endgame, of the justice that was within my grasp. The opportunity finally presented itself one evening after dinner. Jacob sat in the living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, his attention fixed on the TV. I stood in the doorway, my eyes locked on the back of his head, knowing that the moment had come. "Jacob," I called out, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. He turned, irritation flickering across his face at the interruption. "What?" "I wanted to thank you," I said, stepping into the room with measured calm. "For everything. For showing me who I really am." His brow furrowed in confusion, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of my words. "What the hell are you talking about?" I moved closer, my hands sliding into my pocket where the small vial of poison was hidden. My fingers wrapped around it, feeling the cool glass against my skin. "You've taught me so much these past few weeks," I continued, my voice taking on a darker tone. "About power. About control. And now it's time for me to take it back." Before he could react, I lunged forward, emptying the contents of the vial into his drink. The liquid swirled briefly, then settled, its deadly cargo undetectable. Jacob stared at me, his eyes wide with shock and fury. He opened his mouth to curse me, to threaten, but it was too late. He had already taken a sip. "You son of a, ____," he began, but the words choked in his throat as the poison began its work. His body tensed, muscles seizing as he struggled to stand. The glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor as he fell to his knees. The look of terror that had twisted Olivia's features now crossed his face, a grotesque mirror of her final moments. His eyes bulged, his skin paling as he tried to crawl towards me, his fingers digging into the carpet in a futile attempt to reach me. I stepped back, watching with a cold detachment as the poison did its work. His strength faded quickly, his body collapsing onto the floor as the last remnants of life drained from him. In his final moments, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. "You bastard," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. And then he was gone. The house fell silent once more, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall, marking the end of the dangerous game we had been playing. The realization that both Olivia and Jacob were dead hit me like a slow, creeping wave. There was no more fear, no more anger, just the cold, hard truth of what had to be done next. I stood over Jacob's lifeless body, the weight of my actions pressing down on me, the silence in the house unnerving, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do. I knew I had to act quickly. The clock was ticking, and every second that passed was a second closer to being discovered. There was no room for mistakes, no margin for error. I had to erase every trace of them, just as I had with Olivia. The first step was the body. Jacob was heavy, his bulk making the task even more gruesome, but I had already steeled myself for this. I dragged him to the garage, the same way I had done with Olivia, feeling the strain in my muscles as I heaved his dead weight across the floor. The concrete scraped against his clothes, the sound harsh in the stillness of the night. Once in the garage, I wrapped his body in the thick plastic sheeting I had bought for this exact purpose. The material crackled under my fingers as I secured it tightly, ensuring there would be no leaks, no trace of what lay within. I knew I had to be methodical, to treat this as a job that needed doing, nothing more. There was no time for second thoughts. I loaded the wrapped body into the trunk of my car, my movements mechanical, almost detached. The night was dark, the stars obscured by clouds, as if the universe itself was turning away from the horror I was about to commit. I drove to the same secluded spot where I had buried Olivia, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The road was empty, the world asleep, unaware of the dark deeds being carried out in its midst. When I arrived, I wasted no time. I had brought a shovel with me, and I began to dig. The earth was cold and unyielding under my hands, the physical exertion a strange comfort, a way to focus on something other than the reality of what I was doing. I dug deeper and deeper until the hole was large enough to accommodate Jacob's body. I lowered him into the grave with a finality that made my heart pound, the sound of dirt hitting the plastic muffled, the weight of it growing heavier with each shovelful. When the grave was finally filled, I took a moment to catch my breath, my body aching from the effort. The forest around me was silent, as if holding its breath, bearing witness to my crime. With the body buried and the site concealed, I returned home. There was still much to do. The house had to be cleaned, every inch of it scrubbed of any evidence that might link me to the murders. I moved through the rooms with a grim determination, wiping down surfaces, disposing of anything that could be traced back to Olivia or Jacob. I scrubbed the kitchen floor where Olivia had taken her final breath until my hands were raw. I cleaned the living room where Jacob had fallen, erased the last traces of their existence from my home. It was a long, grueling process, but when I finally finished, the house was immaculate. There was no sign of the chaos that had unfolded within its walls, no hint of the nightmare that had consumed my life. But as I stood in the middle of the living room, surveying my work, I felt no sense of victory. Instead, a deep emptiness settled over me. The house no longer felt like home, it was just a building now, filled with memories I wanted to forget. The walls, once comforting, now felt oppressive, closing in on me with the weight of everything that had happened. The silence that had once been a refuge now felt suffocating, a constant reminder of what I had done. I knew then that I couldn't stay. This place, with its memories of pain and betrayal, could never be a part of my future. I had to leave, to start over somewhere far away from the ghosts of my past. I packed a bag with the essentials, a few changes of clothes, some money, a few personal items, and walked out the door without looking back. As I drove away, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape. The road stretched out before me, leading into the unknown. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was free from the pain, the humiliation, the fear that had haunted me for so long. And as I drove into the night, I felt a strange sense of closure. I had taken back control of my life in the only way I knew how, and now I was ready to leave it all behind and begin again.